So today I'd like to speak about the Algerian War, but to do so, I want you to remind you of Juliette Gréco, the iconic singer, and how in 1959 she is still singing about lost loves. Now, why Gréco? Because Gréco was associated with the renewal of Paris after the war and its left bank cabarets and bars. And remember that the left bank had become the shorthand for the Parisian neighborhood of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. This had been an exciting time where young people dressed in black mingled in smoky basement bars and refused conventional norms and danced to American jazz. Now, in 1959, Gréco was famous. Saint-Germain-des-Prés and the left bank were now more myth than reality. And France seemed to bristle with the feverish need to modernize after the immediate devastation of the war. Though remember, not everyone enjoyed these benefits, such as the Algerian workers who were confined to shanty towns on the outskirts of Paris. At the same time, Paris was still buzzing with the news of Algerian-born designer Yves Saint Laurent and his first fashion collection at Christian Dior. American-style magazines such as L'Express and France Observateur inundated French readers with cultural and political news. And in 1959 still, the film Hiroshima Mon Amour, Hiroshima My Love, moved audiences with its tragic love story and received prizes at the now internationally known Cannes Film Festival. This is the year, too, where actress Brigitte Bardot was enjoying unparalleled success, the epitome of youth and new sexual norms, so much so that Simone de Beauvoir wrote that she embodied the immorality of a new age. And Bardot was indeed featured in the first screening of the new monthly TV news magazine, 5 colonnes à la une, launched on state-controlled television on January 9, 1959, the day after World War II hero Général de Gaulle became president of the newly constituted Fifth Republic. But what is missing in that year, and would have been censored on the government-controlled TV, is the Algerian War of Independence that began in 1954, and that by then had already consumed hundreds of thousands of Algerian lives, sent almost 1.5 million conscripts, soldiers across the Mediterranean, and divided intellectuals, politicians, and ordinary citizens on whether Algeria should remain France's prized possession, even as decolonization was engulfing the world. Censored images, confiscated newspapers, and controversial trials meant that the Algerian War was an open secret. It was at once known and invisible. Yet, in Paris, opponents to the war did talk about it endlessly. But what I want us to think about is how they talked about it. So what was the Algerian War, and why did it matter? The Algerian Revolution won independence for Algeria. And for many people then and since, it has become the very archetype of the mid-20th century struggle to end Western colonialism. And Algiers, the capital of Algeria, became known as a mecca of revolutionaries. But as historians have shown, it was also a French Revolution. Now, Algeria had been a French colony since 1830, when it was violently annexed by France on its imperial mission. Unlike other French colonies, it was a settler colony, meaning that it would involve the settlement of Algeria and the subjection of indigenous populations now ruled by a settler that is French colonial administration and population. For France, that meant a French administration was imposed, French language was imposed, French architecture, and the organization of society into unequal categories where Muslims, Algerian Muslims, represented a second-class oppressed society. So on the one hand, Algeria was considered an integral part of France, politically, administratively, and even geographically. It was to be a department like any other in metropolitan France. On the other hand, it was the site of incredible violence and of profound inequality between French settlers and Algerian Muslims. So what was the situation? Well, by 1954, or rather in 1944, the ordinance decreed by the French government granted full political rights to a very small and specific list of elite Algerian men, 65,000, who were also allowed to maintain their local civil status regulated by Muslim law. But in 1945, troubles started brewing because since the 1930s, Algerians had begun organizing and demanding and thinking about their own independence from their colonial ruler. And the 1930s were indeed the year of the emergence of nationalist movements from those who had been colonized and subjugated, demanding their national independence. On May 8th, 1945, Algerians gathered to celebrate the end of the war in Europe, while also demonstrating against colonial rule. They fought with the French police. The police tried to break up the riot, and Algerians attacked French settlers. The French reaction was incredibly brutal. Officially, there were 10,000 casualties. In reality, 45,000 Algerians died in the repression. This was the massacre of Sétif, Kelma, and Guerala, and this was the beginning of a new movement towards decolonization. The incidents became a catalyst for a number of Algerian independence organizations, and Algerian nationalists who had been talking of liberation for decades now regrouped and formed the National Liberation Front, an organization intent on attacking French settlers and allies and agitating for the bringing about of the restoration, and this is a quote, of the Algerian nation. What was the situation in 1954? Well, there were 1 million Europeans and 9 million Muslim Algerians who were supposedly French nationals, but were not citizens. There were segregations. Arabs and Berbers were confined to menial jobs after having been dispossessed of their lands, while the Algerians of European descent were landowners and formed the economic and political elite. So on November 1st, 1954, the National Liberation Front, the FLN as it was known, organized a series of bombs throughout Algeria to agitate and call for independence. Those bombs killed 8 people and wounded others. And they released a manifesto calling, and I quote, "the restoration of the Algerian nation, sovereign, democratic, and social, within a framework provided by Islamic principles." This event was incredibly symbolic. It was the first time since 1830 that a series of coordinated attacks touched all main regions of Algeria. And that which were targeted were institutions and representatives of the French colonial government and of colonial economic exploitation. Now, at the same time, the FLN had a clear political strategy. It wanted to internationalize this conflict because the FLN leaders were very well aware that decolonization was the order of the day. In the years preceding, there had either been agitation for independence or the granting of independence, as France had done to its protectorates, Tunisia and Morocco, and would do so in the years following 1954. So the FLN triumphed ultimately, but not through violence. In fact, they lost the war against the French, but through diplomacy, popular support, and political strategy. So what was the French response in 1954? Well, the Prime Minister, Pierre Mendès France, said, "Algeria is France, not a foreign country." The Minister of Interior, François Mitterrand, responded to, "The only negotiation is war." The conviction that Algeria was part of France dominated throughout the 1950s and was shared by most French people. So the war broke out, and it led to the systematic use of torture by the French army, condoned and even organized by the French state. Summary executions, repression, destructions of villages, massive populations displacements. By 1959, 2 million Algerians were in internment camps in Algeria, and the deaths of officially over 250,000 Algerians. At the same time, violence came from all sides. The FLN used bombing campaigns, but so did the pro-French Algerian organization, the OAS, that emerged in 1961 to try and keep Algeria French, and that almost tried to topple the French government, and organize a bombing campaign on metropolitan soil. The French army also used Harkis, Algerian auxiliaries, many of whom were forcibly conscripted into the army, 1.5 million to help in their repressive military campaign. This was never called a war, and never recognized as such by the French government until 1999. It was only referred to as the events. But what made this war especially brutal was that the French army targeted civilians and made regular and frequent use of torture against Algerians and Europeans supporting Algerian independence, or the FLN. In fact, after discussion in 1957, the French government organized and implemented what it called the pacification campaign. It launched what was then called the Battle of Algiers, where the French army went on a massive repressive series of organized attempts to arrest and squash the FLN, and in the process of terrorizing the Algerian population. And there are many euphemisms like that. And this is when many of these practices I've described come into being. It is not until 1958 that the scandal of torture is brought to light, as some, like Henri Alleg, denounce torture, and I'll talk more a little bit about that. In 1958, too, as the scandal of torture is denounced by those who have been tortured or are French themselves, the government decides to give citizenship to Algerian Muslims. And this is in contrast to Algerian Jews who had been given citizenship since 1870. So to save the colony, to keep Algerian French, de Gaulle comes to power and establishes a new regime, the Fifth Republic, with a constitution. It expands citizenship and political rights to all Algerian men and women. But it also has to deal with the increasing scandal even as the state seizes and censors newspapers and books denouncing torture and the situation in Algeria. Reports estimate that over 2 million Algerians were living and dying more or less as forcibly interned refugees in temporary settlements ranging from tent cities to small villages across Algeria. The French government collectively called these settlements, in another euphemism, regroupment centers, making sure to avoid all explicit references to the language of camps or regimes of concentration, despite, in many cases, their similarities to both French and colonial internment and concentration camps. And these reports became public in late 1959 and 1960, angering many, especially the small anti-colonial leftist intellectual movement. In 1960, lawyer Gisèle Halimi helped publicize the case of Jamila Boupacha. Jamila Boupacha, and I refer you to the Wikipedia page, was arrested on February 10th, 1960 for having placed a bomb, and she was arrested for FLN activity. She was tortured and raped as part of her torture and was then detained and put on trial. On June 29th, 1969, she was sentenced to death. But before then, her lawyer, Jewish Tunisian Gisèle Halimi, enrolled the help of Simone de Beauvoir to write a text denouncing the treatment of Jamila Boupacha and calling for her immediate release. That text, released at the end of 1960, created a huge scandal. And this is especially important because after 1957, the war seemed to spill over in Paris. The left bank basements, where young people had gathered to listen to jazz and enjoy life, were now replaced with images of basements in working-class districts where Algerian men were dragged to be beaten and tortured. And it's important to remember that until 1959, only a minority of metropolitan French people came out speaking against keeping Algerian French, and these included Beauvoir. This is when a number of books came out denouncing torture, and doing so at great risk because one could be arrested in this way. Now, Beauvoir wrote very powerfully about the scandal of torture. In her 1963 memoir, written in the last years of 1962, she described the horror of torture as a monotonous litany of GIGN, that is the electrical torture, bathtubs, hangings, burnings, rapes, ripped nails, and broken bones, concluding it was always the same thing. And she understood well the purpose of this violence. She, and Sartre too, explained that torture, and I quote, was used as a normal and crucial means of obtaining information. It wasn't an excess, but a system. And here, what she did so powerfully is to invoke the horrors of torture by talking very powerfully about bodies. The bodies of Algerian men and women who were being tortured, as well as how it felt for her to do that. Now, as I said, by 1969, torture was becoming public. Its facts known and documented, especially when communist colonial anti-colonial activist and editor Henri Alleg published in 1958 the account of his own ordeal when he was arrested and tortured in Algeria. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote a preface. Both were seized and censored, but only after 70,000 copies were sold before the government banned them. The following year, Alleg's editor published The Gangrene, documenting the torture of 5 Algerian students in Paris by the French police. Alleg's essay and The Gangrene brought to the public the voices of those tortured, the victims, rather than just that of soldiers who had participated, the perpetrators. And Beauvoir used that knowledge to write about Jamila Boupacha and to talk about the horror and the shame that the French people must feel in the face of this horror. And she said that complicity is what the French must resist in this way. Now, this continued and worsened in 1961 when the OAS, a far-right pro-French Algerian group made of former military officials, started a bombing campaign both in Algeria and metropolitan France. They bombed Sartre's apartment, and it is not until the wounding of a 5-year-old, as they also tried to bomb actress Brigitte Bardot and Minister of Interior's apartments, that the public felt horrified. And this is when public opinion started turning. But this wasn't the end of brutal repression. On October 17th, 1961, Algerians who were subject to a curfew decided to peacefully demonstrate in the streets of Paris to ask for independence and to protest their conditions. The police was asked to repress the demonstration, and this unleashed unprecedented violence. And the next morning, hundreds of bodies of Algerian men were found in the Seine. There was no acknowledgement of this horror. There was only mounting, finally, public indignation, leading in 1962 to a sudden turn of events. When a number of trade unions and the Communist parties decided to organize in February 1962 a demonstration protesting the Algerian war, the police too engaged in brutal repression, and 8 French people died. Following that, 1 million people descended in the streets protesting the death of innocents. A month later, the French government signed the Evian Accords, signaling that Algeria had been granted its independence. But this signaled the ways in which the question of the Algerian war and the question of who could be considered a legitimate political subject would haunt France much longer and for decades to come.